Last fall, when I drove up to Cape Breton to hear the music and language of my ancestors, I had an extraordinary encounter with a former police chief. I knew Nova Scotia was full of Gaelic stories and folklore, but I was surprised to find such a man who believed in the little people, the fairies. Not only did he believe in them, he had seen some evidence.
I believe there was such a thing as fairies. Well, I seen evidence. One time, the McLeans, where I grew up, they bought a mare from Sydney, and she was a beautiful mare, and she had a beautiful mane and beautiful tail. And I used to pass an awful lot of the time combing out her mane and combing out her tail. And one time morning, I went up to the barn to comb the mane out, and the mane was all braided. So I went down to the house and I said to them, I was only around 12 then, I suppose. And I told them, there's something wrong with the mare's mane. So they all came up, and the old fellow said right away, he says, open the she, the work of the fairies. I believed it was the work of the fairies because that was what the McLeans said. And anyway, Mr. McLean, he went up to the barn and he stayed there all night. But shortly before dawn, he kind of nodded and fell asleep. When he woke up, the mane was braided. And there was nobody came into the barn. The doors was, who in the heck was going to braid a mare's mane anyway? It had to be done by some spirits of some kind. So I believe it would be the fairies. I can still see it, boy, after all those years, the way the mane was braided.
Fairy lore has been with us for thousands of years. Most indigenous cultures throughout history refer to supernatural creatures or beings that live in some other dimension. The Greek satyrs, the Roman fauns, the divas, the Celtic Sidhe, and the English fairies. Pixies, elves, call them what you like. They've been with us since the beginning of time. But the notion that they might still be with us had not occurred to me for a long time. Not since my grandmother had enchanted me with the tales of the little people that she believed were real. I was inspired to find out if the fairies are still with us. I began my search in my daughter's grade 1 class. Who here thinks that fairies are real? I used to be able to see fairies. My grandmother believed in fairies. I found it very easy to see them when I was your age. But as you get older, for some reason, it's harder to see them.
Since the tooth fairy is real, maybe other fairies are real.
Are there boy fairies, do you think?
No. Yes.
Ben?
Yes.
When I was little, or your age, I could see them, but now I'm having a real hard time. Do you have any advice that you can give me?
I think fairy doesn't remember adults. Grown-ups do more things to pollute the planet than kids, and it ruins their home. I think just maybe kids have better eyesight. If you really stare at a plant, they probably wouldn't come because they don't like to be totally visible. Sometimes they just like to have people see their movement so that they believe it.
Simone, what do you think?
Well, I have a suggestion how maybe you could look at them. If you just stay still for a little while, and if you see them, you shouldn't get up or anything, you just stay still.
In the adult world of materialism and rational thinking, it's hard to imagine that fairies could be real. In the past several generations, we seem to have abandoned them, relegated them to the nursery, transformed them into cartoon characters that have no significant place in our modern world. Science has turned an ancient belief into superstition. This desire to believe in an other world hasn't changed over time. Some say that today's aliens are a repackaged version of a very old set of myths and narratives of fairy lore. I wonder if it's our modern alienation, our detachment from the land, that causes us to interpret the fairy realm as an alien experience. A realm that our predecessors knew well and respected. In Devon, England, I met a young man, Peter Aziz, who was trained to see this other world. His Hungarian grandmother practiced shamanism and taught him how to see the fairies.
This place is known as the Pixies' Parlour. It is definitely a place where the fairies come through. This particular rowan tree, being quite an old one, and has been chosen as a doorway by the fairies. They come through from their own world, and so this, because of this power spot here with the water and so on, it's become an easy spot for them to use, and so they've made it into a kind of sacred tree where it'll always be a doorway.
And have you seen the fairies here?
Oh yes, quite regularly. There are certain fairies I speak to regularly, others come and go.
Do they take on an actual physical form, or is it in the realm of the imagination?
It's a mixture. They have a form, but with not very clear boundaries. They have a human-like form, without being quite human.
Is it possible for you to see fairies now with us here?
I can tune in and see where they are. There's none right in this very spot, but I can tune in and feel where they are. I do have a sense that there's one up by the holly tree further up the stream. And obviously we need to go and talk to it to see if it's going to be open. It might be a bit shy.
But you think we can maybe go up and...
Yes, it's possible. We can certainly look at it. I can feel where it is, and so as we approach it, we'll see if it stays there. Sitting just behind this tree, just like a small male fairy, just sitting there. He was kind of meditating by the stream, and he's taken interest in what we're doing, and he's watching. I've spoken to him to explain why we're here. And, you know, he's quite curious. If you make a heart contact with them and they can feel your intentions, then they're more likely to show themselves to you. But they do affect your mind. They can control your imagination. They can control what you see. And if they don't want you to see them, they won't. But this one is not unwilling. He's still a little bit curious, still observing.
Where is it now?
It's sitting behind this tree, right in the waterfall. Its head is kind of above the level of the waterfall. There's also two standing behind it. They've all come to see what's happening.
I hadn't planned that I would actually try to photograph a fairy, but Peter had me looking. Even if I couldn't see anything, something inside me was stimulated. And when your imagination is let loose, you begin to see things differently. I'll admit, I began looking for fairies, which surprised me. The rational side of me wondered, should I seek professional help? So I spoke with Dr. Mark Fox, a scholar in the subject of seeing the paranormal.
I think it depends on what you mean by see. Seeing means lots of things to lots of different people. I don't think we can photograph them although lots of people in various times have claimed to have done just that. But I think we can see them in other ways. Something either exists objectively outside of ourselves in the physical world, or something doesn't exist. I'm just wondering whether the realm of the imagination, the realm in which fairies dwell, is in fact a sort of intermediate realm, neither completely in your head, neither completely in the world, but somehow crossing over, transcending the two, belonging to both and yet belonging to neither. And that, of course, is something which many educated, secular, scientifically trained Westerners find difficult to accept. They either exist or they don't. If you can't photograph them, if you can't weigh them, if you can't interview them, if you can't measure them, if you can't capture them and put them in a cage and put them on display, then they don't exist, except, of course, as figments of your imagination. But say they do exist in some intermediate realm, neither in the world nor in your head. Perhaps there's a third place where they dwell, because this seems to be the place where poets and artists and composers often dwell as well.
In Devon, not far from the Pixies' parlour, I went to see the harpist Elizabeth Jane Baldry.
I'd always loved fairies when I was a little girl, and I used to see them all the time when I was a child, and just used to look under rose bushes and see them. And in fact, in my parents' garden, my father built a little house specially for the fairies, which had a wonderful roof decorated with broken shells and bits of pottery, and it was a house just for the fairies, so I was always looking in there. And I loved them and I saw them, but as I grew older, I saw them less and less and less, until in my late teens I really stopped seeing them completely. And then, just apart from a couple of isolated possibilities, I think I've lost the knack now. We get involved in earning a living and paying the gas bill and saving our pensions, and all those really boring things. It's such a shame. Fairies are great musicians themselves, and there are lots of melodies that are said to have come from the fairies. Classic example is Thomas the Rhymer, and Thomas was a harpist, and he saw the elf queen passing through the woods one day when he was sitting playing his harp under a tree, and he thought she was just really gorgeous, and he said, "Oh, are you the Queen of Heaven?" He thought it was the Blessed Mother riding through the wood. She says, "No, I'm the Queen of Elfland, far more fun." You'll have far more fun, she says. She says, "Thomas, come harp and carp with me, Thomas." Carp is an old English word for singing, making merry. "Come harp and carp with me, Thomas." And he does. He goes into the underworld with her, into Elfland, for 7 years. This music, written by the Victorian harpists themselves, who were immensely popular in their day, it takes you right into the Victorian world. It's a doorway into how they lived, their belief system. And at that time, there was a huge resurgence of interest in spiritualism and the fairy realm. It was due to lots of social factors. It was a time of such massive social change, the whole birth of the scientific age. For the first time, there was an awareness of our folklore heritage, which had been taken for granted up until then. And it was really a respectable area of belief. It was actually far nicer to believe in angels and fairies than that we'd be monkeys. Really, much more attractive for a delicate Victorian maiden. It's interesting nowadays, when we're again in a time of huge social change, that there is this resurgence of popular spirituality, if you like, and people wanting to believe in something in a world that's increasingly materialistic. What matters is whether or not one's life is improved by any belief. And fairies do add a certain level of fun to life in a world that can sometimes be quite grey. Fairies never worry about the things that humans worry about.
It's worth pointing out that fairies have not always been figures with wings that flit from leaves to trees to lilies on ponds, waving wands and shining brightly. In early fairy lore, and remember fairy lore has been with us for hundreds and thousands of years, the fairies were often highly unpleasant. They'd steal children. They'd abduct people from quiet country roads. They'd return them often days, weeks, months, years later, these people having no recollection of any missing time at all. Fairies were enchanters. Fairies were deceivers. The very word fairy actually refers to the sort of enchantment, the spell they cast over people. The Victorians took the fairy folk and homogenised them. They turned this splendidly diverse and somewhat motley crew into very uniform characters that really wouldn't hurt a fly. In so doing, they transformed the fairy lore from its richness, its intricacy and its wonder into something which was stamped and approved by Victorian society for Victorian society.
The artist Brian Froud has learned that fairies, like humans, are bound to nature. His work draws on this capacity for creation as well as destruction.
Traditionally, fairies blight things. They blight crops. They blight people. They cause problems. The fairies were blamed for the great potato famine in Ireland. Fairies were blamed for misshapen or sickly children. So man's always had this real interesting and difficult relationship with fairies. I think nowadays people have the modern impression that fairies are all sweetness and light and pretty, but they are often dark and difficult. Now this one is a very bad fairy indeed. I think the less said about this one, the better. This fairy is the snagger and causes tears in clothes and rips people's stockings. And its other aspect just causes problems, snags in day-to-day working or in events. This is Perfidious puka, fairy often found in Ireland and also in Scotland. And they are, like all fairies, shapeshifters, change shapes and turn into different things, often into animals. No, I can't prove to people that fairies exist. I mean, I believe that they do. I can only show a glimpse into my belief. My inspiration for fairies originally came from the landscape, was from trees and from rocks, and my feeling that these things were alive and encompassed spirit. I started to study folklore, really, I suppose, in a sense, and mythology, and as gradually as I got into it, I came sort of deeper and deeper and became more and more enthralled with the idea about real fairies. People often ask me, how do you see fairies? And I say, well, you don't see them through the eyes, you see them through your heart. And that took me a long time to learn, because I was always trying to see them through my eyes. Fairies are definitely very much of a realm. They're all interconnected and constantly flowing. Their energies are flowing from one space into another, one dimension into another.
So there's such a thing as real fairies?
Of course there is. They live in those in-between states, between waking and dreaming, in the twilight between light and dark. They're being creatures and spiritual beings that human beings have lived with forever.
My grandmother read me fairy tales, but she knew the difference between a fairy tale and a true fairy story. She believed they were real. I was 13 when we traveled together to her beloved Highlands of Scotland, and when I questioned her on her belief in the fairies, she took me on a pilgrimage to the Isle of Skye to visit the places in the landscape the fairies are known to be. Once you know the Gaelic word for fairy, she, which translates as people of the hill, you can more easily find their haunts. They live in the glens and mountains like Glen Shee or Schiehallion, and underground in the knolls and mounds known as duns. I'll always remember my visit to Dunvegan Castle. We went to see the famous 1,200-year-old fairy flag. Legend has it was given to a MacLeod by his fairy lover. My grandmother took me here when I was 13.
I would have been that same age the first time I saw it.
Is that right?
Yes.
When I returned this year to see the flag, I went with Dalina Wallace, a writer and storyteller. She reminds me of my grandmother.
There it is. There's the fairy flag. Isn't it beautiful?
I was disappointed when I saw this ratty old piece of cloth, and I couldn't imagine how it had enchanted me so many years ago. It was quite disturbing. So you believe absolutely that fairies are real?
Of course.
They're not just out of picture books?
No, they're not out of picture books at all.
They're not out of our imagination?
They're not out of our imagination either. Fairies are real.
And they do things like us?
They do things, yes. Same as we do, only a lot better. And with a lot less fuss. They do.
Fun.
Yes.
Now, are the fairies still here? Have they gone away at all?
Oh, no. Oh, my goodness, no, they've been here since before time. They're likely to be here until after time. They have been seen in this particular spot, in the pools, and that's how they got the name the Fairy Pools. Many, many hundred years ago, there was a shepherd, when the glens were populated, walking home in an evening, when he heard the laughter and the hilarity, and there in the pool were young fairy maidens, stripped naked, having fun, having innocent fun among themselves. He stood and watched. That was mistake number one. Now, the fairies are very private people. They don't like being spied on. The second mistake he made was to have clapped his hands and shouted, "Well done, girls." You don't do that to fairies either. There was a deathly silence. The laughter was stilled. They vanished completely from sight. Well, he was going to make for home when he turned round. Behind him was an old woman wearing a shawl. And she says to him, "You have upset and embarrassed my people. For that you will pay dearly. From the time you close your eyes and sleep tonight, you will never see with them again." The man lost his sight. He died an old man, still blind. You don't fall out with the fairies. You don't displease them in any way. If you do, then you can expect reprisals. But if you're kind to the fairies, if you're nice to the fairies, if you believe in them, then you're all right. They're there for you. I grew up with the belief that God was there on one hand and fairies were there on the other, and the devil was somewhere in between. And that's what I believe in, and that's what stayed with me all those years. And it will continue to stay with me. I've passed it on to my children, and now I'm passing it on to my grandchildren.
Now, have you seen any fairies?
I don't know. I could have, I don't know.
It was with stories in places like this that my grandmother convinced me, a cynical teenager, of the possibility of a fairy realm. And when you're still and quiet in a place like this, you begin to see and feel a presence, as if you were no longer alone.
When your grandmother told you about fairies, she was telling you the truth. She wanted to add another dimension to your life. It's a gift from your grandmother to you.
On Loch Tay in the shadow of Schiehallion Mountain, I went to visit Mervyn Brown, a shepherd, and his friend Gregor Hutchison, a retired schoolteacher and geographer. I was told he had developed some theories on fairy places. With the help of divining rods, he's come up with a rational explanation as to why these fairy sites may have a certain physical and emotional impact on those who visit them.
I myself have come across a lot of fairy places in Scotland, and they all have they all affect one's being. You feel vibes, or whatever you want to call it, sometimes good, sometimes bad.
And you can pick it up with your rods.
And I can pick it up with my rods, and I get a very good reaction here with rods, yes. But I do think it's something to do with earth energy, but just how it works is still a mystery. Maybe you can't explain it, but it's there. if you have a feeling of bad omen at a certain place, that in people's minds was a place to be avoided and probably more connected with the fairies. People were none too happy about fairies for the most part. I know there are good fairies and bad fairies, but I think most people like to keep clear of them when they could. This seems to be the centre of the spiral. I think you'd also find there's an energy line running this way.
Mm-hmm.
If I go back to this direction here and work across.
Mm-hmm.
Now, have we got bad energy here? And we're thinking of bad energy, and one can also think of evil things.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do that, you get the energy picked up.
Mm-hmm.
But if I think of good things and good energy, perhaps Christian things, God, Jesus Christ and so on,
mm-hmm.
there's absolutely nothing at all to affect the rods.
That's
Now, how one explains that, I don't know.
Uh-huh.
But having just started to do this just now, I can feel my head a bit heavy.
Uh-huh.
And this, I think, is the effect of the energy on this hill.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And I feel it a bit oppressive.
Mm-hmm. This knoll, Sheehan, whatever you like to call it,
Yes.
You associate with fairies.
Yes.
And you've proved that there's energy lines converging upon it.
Yes.
My question would be, why was this revered or otherwise as a fairy knoll?
And I would think that our ancestors, probably without rods, if they came to this spot, they may have also had this feeling of oppression or, you know, a bad feeling about the place. And so, as time went on and folklore grew up, people associated this with a place to be avoided and with bad fairies.
We, as humans, have obviously lost a lot of these finer
Yes.
points of assessing matters and
Yes.
feeling these vibes, you like to call them that. We've become divorced from nature. Those that don't want to know about these sort of things, they wouldn't feel a thing.
That is true, yes. I know one place I was at, one of the islands in the west, top of the hill, and there was literally a huge concentration of this very good energy, as I call it. And I felt on top of the world. I really did. I was on top of the hill 300 feet, but that wasn't the reason why I felt on top of the world. I just felt very good inside. And I felt renewed energy. It was flowing into me. I couldn't believe it. The very opposite from the fairy knoll we were at earlier today. So I think there's a sort of good and bad energy released by the earth, just the same as there's poisonous plants and there's good plants to eat. We can learn to know the difference, sometimes the hard way, at least our ancestors probably did it that way. And so in the same way, there's good and bad energy which can affect people's lives. I think our early ancestors were particularly aware of that. We are beginning to relearn what they used to know.
Ireland is a place where the fairies could never be completely forgotten. Every salient feature in the landscape has a pre-Christian legend describing an other world inhabited by these magical, immortal beings. You can't escape the mystery and physical evidence of prehistoric dolmens and other ancient dwelling sites. Here they are known as fairy forts, where the little people are said to be seen. I went to the mythical Loch Gur, a place inhabited for some 4,000 years or more. It is said the lake is a portal to Tir na Nog, a sort of Celtic heaven, a land of eternal youth, where the fairies occasionally lure a mortal. I was standing by the edge of the lake, talking to a farmer about the enchanted legends of Loch Gur. As he talked, the clouds rolled in and the sky darkened. At that moment, I looked out on the lake, and the trees began to sparkle, as if someone had turned on lights. Fairy lights. I was astonished at the sight of this, and said to the farmer, "This looks like fairyland." He just nodded with a smile, and said, "That island is a fairy fort."
It is often said, and I'm sure it is true, that they're the remnants of old gods.
The storyteller, Eddie Lenahan.
When the big riot occurred in heaven and Lucifer decided he wasn't happy there anymore, well, we all know what happened. God finally asserted his authority and got the upper hand, and he decided these guys have to go. So he opened the doors of heaven and down they went. But the only problem was it wasn't Lucifer and all the other angels were going. The whole place was being emptied. Until Michael the Archangel looked around him, his friends, enemies, everybody was going. It seemed that he says to God, Lord, he says, just close the gates quicker, we'll be here alone. And God saw the sense in that, closed the gates of heaven, and immediately, wherever they were, the ones that had fallen into hell, they're the devils that we know. The ones that were still remaining, of course, the few that still remained, they were the angels. But the others were falling, and wherever they were falling at the time, some of them in the middle of the air, that's where they were and are for all eternity. The ones that had fallen to ground, they're the ones that live in the earth. The ones that had fallen into the sea, they're the sea fairies. And the ones who are still in the air, well, they're the air fairies today. So that's the story that you'll get to explain where they came from. They are, in fact, from above. They're the fallen angels. But that's only a Christianization of something that's a way, way older. Look at the people who believe in ordinary conventional religion. For them, the other world is the world of paradise, heaven, hell, the saints, the angels, God, eternity, call it what you like, because eternity under normal circumstances doesn't make sense. Nobody likes to laugh at another person's religion. It's a very strange thing to do. And the fairy faith was not a formal church religion, but it was a faith. They're part of what we are, whether we like it or not. You don't have to believe in them, but they're there. They're there. Recently, I went into a pub. Within 10 minutes, 3 or 4 people in that same bar were, what did I tell you about what my grandfather told me? This thing hasn't gone away.
It's not hard to find musicians like Hugh Boyle and his daughter Kathleen who have stories of the Ciol Shi, the gift of fairy music that was bestowed on mortals like her legendary grandfather.
What made him stand out from the ordinary player was his embellishments, and he said he was taught this by the fairies. And this came about when one night he was sent out to get some turf. He disappeared, they didn't know where he went at all, and he said he had been taken away with the fairies to play at a fairy's wedding. And he was playing there all night, and he says he had never had such a night in his life playing for the fairy's wedding, and they put him drunk. They got him drunk, and he was introduced to these 2 fiddle players, Seamus Watchew and Cracking the Crick. And apparently these were 2 very famous fiddlers in their day, and they played the old music. They called it the enchanted music of Ireland. And they began to show him how to embellish his music, the embellishments that they played in their music, and they bestowed a lot of the knowledge on him. So when he came home from the fairy's wedding, they came into the house and everybody was up in arms. They had no idea where he'd been at all.
Certainly he was influenced by something that we never could find out or understand, really.
You could hear the blackbird singing. They would be way up in the top bit of the fiddle, playing, way up at the bridge, playing, and you could hear the blackbird singing. You would swear it was a bird, you would never think it was a fiddle.
It was a gift he'd received, and he said from the fairies, and we never ever doubted that.
I don't know if they're still here, but you don't hear many accounts of fairies today. It's mostly all in the past. Maybe it's because people are too scared to say, well, I had an encounter with the fairies, you know, in case they get taken away to a mental hospital or something. People start making fun of them. I've never seen any fairies. I've never had any reason to say, oh, there's proof it's definitely a fairy. But I would never disregard them either, you know. if you mention your name here, Kathleen Boylan, you're always Neil the Fiddler's granddaughter, and Dad's always Neil the Fiddler's son. Part of your history now, but whether it was true or not, people accept it now, and that's it. He's known as the fiddler that had the encounter with the fairies. I don't wish they would take me away because, you know, you get good fairies and you also get bad fairies, you know, and they often say that if you go looking for a fairy, you'll never see it.
The old people used to believe that if you went out on May Eve, 30th of April, you were out of your mind, because that was the night that the fairies were always moving from fort to fort. If you happened to meet them when they were on their revels, well, then anything could happen to you. You could get twisted, you could get paralyzed, your eyes could be put in two different directions. I know a man, for example, who is convinced his hair fell out. Every rib of his hair fell out. He was going on this particular night. He saw this woman coming towards him, or what looked like a woman because it was a shawled figure, dark. And as the person was passing, he saluted, got no reply. She might be 3 or 4 feet from him. But just as she was passing him, she put out her hand and just touched him like that. No, there was no hit or anything like that, just touched him. Never saluted him, never anything. And he was dumbfounded because the least you could do was say good night if she was going to touch him. Sounded friendly. She went about her business. And he went home, still wondering. Well, the following morning when he woke up, his hair was all on the pillow. Every bit of it. He was as bald as Kojak. And he went to doctors. They thought it was alopecia, I think they call that condition where your hair falls out. They gave him this lotion and liniments and tablets and pills, and he went to experts and all kinds of... Never came back. And he was convinced then of what he had met. On that particular night, it was one of them. He told me that himself.
Are you witch, or are you fairy, or are you the wife of Michael Carey?
Bertie Bryce.
There was a true story. This man, he was Michael Carey. His wife disappeared. I think she was away for 2 days, and she came back again. And he maintained it wasn't his wife, and she was a changeling. And he done her in. He murdered her. And the police took him up. And he used that as his defence, that it wasn't his wife, that it was a changeling that the fairies had left, and he got off. I mean, that's quite true.
Why would the fairies want to take away his wife?
Oh, I don't know that. Why did the fairies do anything? There's some very strange habits now, there's no doubt about it. I don't know what they wanted of them. Don't know.
But you wouldn't do anything to upset the fairies, you said?
Oh, no way. If I give you a saw and pointed you a fairy bush, told you that was a fairy bush, and I wouldn't touch it, and I give you a saw and told you to cut it down, would you cut it down?
No.
No, well, you are. But you don't believe in the fairies.
Well, I do.
Well, no, I wouldn't interfere with them, good, bad, or indifferent. If I had the ability, I would do them a good turn.
In modern Ireland, the rational can take over the poetic approach to fairy places. Not long ago, it would have been unheard of to level a 4,000 or 5,000 year old fairy fort for a new highway. For some, these sites are simply Bronze Age dwellings. For others, the forts are the sacred ground of the fairies.
It goes straight in the face of anything I have ever been told about people interfering with fairy places. They don't do it. I'm amazed that the people here would actually do it, and they're Irish people. Sure, I mean, that's a scene of desolation. Right, look at that. Wait, within the next 7, 8, 9 years, watch the statistics. for accidents along this stretch of road, and I bet you they'll be out of the ordinary and they'll be much above the average. What's going to happen to these guys who've done this destruction here? I dread to think, and that's what I'd like to ask them tomorrow. Lads, how long do you expect to live?
Eddie was unable to save the fort, but down the road is a rare fairy thorn tree. He's determined to convince local council to reroute the highway, and the construction crew, fearful of retribution, have refused to touch the tree. His public outcry has caught the attention of local press.
Can you hear the fairies?
Now, the New York Times has flown in to investigate.
Eddie, how do you know that that's a fairy tree?
Well, usually, if you talk to the older people, you'll find that they'll always advise you, if you go into a field where there's a single scacht, as they would call it. A scacht is just the Irish for a bush. And a single white thorn bush, be careful, because usually these things, they don't grow alone, and if one of them is alone in a field, it probably means that there is something behind it.
If there's a single white bush, be careful.
Yes.
What could happen to you if you're not careful?
I've heard of men who were dared to cut down trees like this, and did. And inevitably, while they were at it, while something happened, it might be only a splinter to get in their hand, or maybe a splinter to hit them in the face, go blind, lose a hand. The thing festers out of all proportion, that kind of thing.
They don't look like leprechauns, right? Leprechaun is different.
No, a leprechaun is one of the fairies. There were classes of them, but they all had one thing in common. They were all small. There was none of them, we'll say, more than 2 feet tall. And you meet somebody who's that size, you're not going to mistake him for a human being.
Do you think you ever saw one?
No, I never did, and I never want to.
Why not?
I'd be frightened. I honestly would.
And what are your chances to save it?
I'd hope at this stage that the council wouldn't be so stupid as to cut it down, because apart from anything else, it could be a wonderful tourist attraction.
In here, that's your place. Eddie, have you heard any specific stories in relation to the Latoon tree?
I'd be the last person to make much of this if I hadn't.
Okay.
And a story I heard from a local man there who is now dead, God rest the man, but he told me that that particular bush was where the fairies from Kerry, who would be, say, part of the Munster host of fairies, when they'd be on their way to Connacht to fight the fairies of Connacht. And the fairies were always battling. And that man, he told me, he said on several occasions he remembers seeing this white stuff, like phlegm, gobs of it here and there around the bush. And he was quite in no doubt whatsoever that that was the blood of the fairies, because the blood of the fairies isn't red like our blood. The blood of the fairies is white. Any of the older people will tell you that.
And of course the place, and I would have heard something like this before, the place where a fairy would die, and there's people laughing at you and I now, Eddie. They're laughing at us. But there's also a lot of people, even young people in their teens and 20s, who would have inherited those beliefs and that folklore, and again,
And
who
their
wouldn't,
subconscious.
and in their subconscious. Now, I would have heard many times that a place where a fairy died or met a disaster or had his or her heart broken was always very heavily spiritually charged.
Yes. And some people will even say that that's where such a bush grows.
Yes.
I don't know,
Yes.
different stories for different people, but they all have one thing in common: you don't interfere with them. As you
Eddie
say,
has been battling for weeks on the radio and in the press with Tom Carey, the county engineer, who claimed he would cut the tree down himself.
Well, frankly, I was both amused and amazed at the level of interest there's been in this tree. Personally, I don't have the difficulty with it. In fact, I was asked if I would have a difficulty with removing it, and I wouldn't. But as I said, people do have these concerns, and folklore is folklore. But I mean, I'm an engineer, and I deal with things as they're presented to me. I suppose what's important to tell you is that, as it so happens, I think we'll be able to save it, because it's between the highway and the slip road.
A battle of sorts seemed to have been won. There's enough doubt, or that you can create enough doubt in people's mind, that they will say, let's leave it.
Dr. John McInnes is a scholar of Celtic mythology and folklore.
The state of belief in the fairies today is rather, I think, a complex one, because I've known people who have said, well, I've never seen fairies, but there are so many stories about them, and in the past, people must have been able to see something. Some will say, well, these may have been hallucinations, or other people will say, no, it must have been a kind of second sight that people had, and we've lost this faculty for seeing these beings. Other people will say they did exist in the past, they don't exist now, and others again will say, oh, I don't know, I doubt if they ever existed, but here's an interesting story. Now, according to our genealogy from Uist, we are descended from the Seals, and my granddaughter Sinead is one of these descendants of the Seal woman.
Well, there was a man, and he was walking on, well, the beach, and there was some seals, and they took off their skins, and they went into the water, and the man went and got one of the skins, and he went into a hiding place, and then the woman came out, and they all put their skins on except for the one which had her skin stolen. The man took her home, and he married her, and they had children, and all that time the skin had been hidden in a haystack or a barn or a trunk or something like that. And then one of their children discovered the skin in the barn or something, and he told his mum, and she went, got the skin, and she went back to the sea again.
And that was related to you and part of your family?
Yeah.
So how do you feel being part of the...
Just, it feels quite good.
Is it?
In some of the variants of that story, that family and the descendants have good luck ever after. These are stories that come out of the mists of antiquity. You just cannot pin them down to time. In fact, myths, if they have a validity precisely because they are timeless. They may be clothed in the details of a given time and a given community, but their essence is outside time. I would say, for instance, that one could talk about the belief in the fairy hill and the gifts of music and so forth that come from the fairies, and also the dangerous things that come from the fairy hill, as constituting a metaphor for the imagination and for the unconscious mind. The imagination in many commentaries throughout known history admits that there is a potential danger in the unconscious and in the imagination. The imagination is a dark side, in other words.
In your view, do the fairies exist outside of ourselves, in another realm, or is it a mirror of our own lives?
Oh, I think all these things come from the human imagination, all of it. Of course, the question is, what is the imagination? But no, I mean, I am a scholar of this belief, but I don't necessarily have any belief at all in them as out there objectively, as it were. If I, for example, were out in the mountains and saw a figure, a man, let's say, clad in muted green, I might think, well, that's a gamekeeper or somebody out shooting deer, and if he was skulking around and disappearing behind mounds and hillocks, probably he was out poaching. If my great-great-grandfather, for example, had seen such a figure, he would probably come back home and say, well, I saw a fairy today. I saw a fairy today.
Late one afternoon, Steve Oldale, a construction worker from Glasgow, had an unusual experience on Schiehallion, known locally as the Fairy Hill.
It was 4 or 5 o'clock in the evening. It started getting kind of remarkable, and then out of this blue sky, a kind of wisp of cloud came across, and I think gauze-like, I think would describe it. You could easily see through it, but it kind of sort of drifted in. And so I was watching that, thinking, that's nice, enjoying the scenery, and a very small amount of dew vapour sort of came down from that. You could just see that sort of tiny drops. With the sun behind me, Schiehallion before me, it cast a rainbow sort of right over Schiehallion. I was like, yes, it's wonderful. I felt privileged to be there. I thought, this is good. There's a stream between me and the mountain, probably about the same distance away as this stream here, about 100 yards perhaps at the most. And that's kind of tinkling away. And I started to hear it as music, as, I suppose what you'd term as fairy music, kind of Irish harp music, or sort of some Scottish music of some kind, sort of stuff. And I was kind of almost enraptured, I suppose, thinking, what a lucky person I am, being here now. And on the edge of my vision, the kind of lower vision, I was kind of looking up at the mountain. Kind of down here at the bottom, I kind of caught a movement with my eye, looked down, and there's this small guy, a wee fellow, I suppose you'd call him, be about 4 foot high. But what it's about is rolling my shadow up, is at my head. It's about halfway down the head. Yeah? It's kind of got it into a tube about so big. It's very business-like, rolling away at my head, and then kind of lower down. I saw it. He kind of looked at me, and then his eyes dropped. My shadow's quite long, 40 yards or whatever, but I could perceive that he kind of looked down at my feet. I looked down to my feet, and there was his female counterpart, a pair of silver shears. You wouldn't call them scissors, really. They're sort of like sheep shears or something like that, old-fashioned things. And she's working away around my toe, sort of cutting the shadow off at my toe. My sensation was like, what? What's going on here? This is outrageous. I kind of looked back at him and kind of checked the scene out, and then I just sort of went, oi! It's just like that, oi. And he looked at her, and she looked at him, and poof, it was gone. Just gone. I sort of looked at it, did anybody else see that? There's nobody for miles. My sensation was like astonishment, but not angry, not frightened or fearsome or anything like that. It was just, cheeky wee bastards, really, I suppose, is what I thought, yeah.
And what did they, do you remember what they looked like? Do you have a detail?
Oh, yeah, great. The nearest thing I've seen to them is these bog people they dug up in the Netherlands with a really tan skin. Their skin was kind of, really like that. They weren't bearded. There was some facial hair. The one being closer, I could see the facial hair on her, and that was substantial, if you like, but not what you'd call bearded. Filthy, I'm a builder, my hands get dirty, but these fingernails were, they were seriously in bad shape. Could do with a wash. The clothes were all made of leather of some kind of like chamois leather. Small hats, kind of sewed together quite crudely. Kind of a smock tied round the middle with some kind of fabric underneath it. And equally manky, equally sort of covered in, not covered in muck, but like sort of seeped, deeply ingrained. Yeah, as if they'd sort of come out of the bog. But they were dry, they weren't wet as if they'd come out of a bog, as if they'd been stained by a bog. The bog people that really sums them up for me, visually, even down to the wizened sort of skin. I don't think they were trying to do me any favours. And it doesn't seem like a favour to somebody to take your shadow away. It sounds like death. of some kind, or permanent insanity is what I would imagine if they took your shadow. It'd be some kind of crazy thing locked up in a cell somewhere. So I don't really feel that I owe them any favours. And, you know, perhaps, you know, people should know about this. You know, there's all kinds of possibilities for people. And if there are creatures from another that can just disappear and appear at will and mess about with our lives, tinker with my life. I think people should be aware of this. Yeah. Not that it seems to happen to many people, but it is a possibility. It is a possibility. And, you know, I don't think people should close their minds to it. Having said that, having my mind open to it, I've many times tried to recreate, you know, the kind of feeling I've wandered through the hills in a lackadaisical fashion, you know, waiting for something like this to happen again. But nothing, yeah. Drawn a blank every time. I've seen rainbows, you know, I've heard streams, you know, but I've never heard, you know, like that music. I've never seen a cloud appear from out of a blue sky from nowhere and, you know, produce a rainbow to entrance me. But I would like it to happen again. Yeah. I'd like some more, like encounter, just to see what they're about.
When I returned home, I realized that for me, the fairy realm is a state of mind that restored my sense of wonder. It can transform the mundane to the magical. I felt all of this powerfully in the ancient landscape of Ireland and Scotland, but could I feel this in Canada? I had my doubts as I was traveling through Cape Breton. I was even questioning my belief when I saw this hill in the distance that looked like a fairy knoll. I drove by imagining I was back in Scotland, where fairy places are easily found. I was on my way to see a friend, but I decided to go back and inquire about the hill. It was in Eskasoni, the largest Mi'kmaq reserve in Nova Scotia. And sure enough, when I inquired, Patrick Marshall confirmed my suspicion. He wanted to show me a place on the hill where he and his sisters had seen something.
It's called Wugaladimoj, the little people. I remember my grandmother used to tell us stories about the little people, and you know, when you're a little kid going into the woods, she would say, "Come back or they'll take you away." Something just came out of the woods just behind over there, and you knew it wasn't an animal because it was standing on two legs. And it was about this high, and the way it ran down with, and you knew it was real stocky. It ran down and more or less hopping. More or less it was hopping. And then it just stopped right over there. And we were standing right here. And what I seen was a very tiny person. And you know, like I said, it was a person. I knew it wasn't an animal. Just the way it stood there, the way it looked at us. All of a sudden, he jumped back into the woods. As soon as he just disappeared, the girl screamed, I yelled, and we started running back down. And that was about 15, 16 years ago. And I told the girls not to mention this to anybody, because it was, to me, it wasn't normal. And I think it was about 5 years after that we started talking about this. And, you know, people kind of thought that it was just a myth, but I kind of believe different.
I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised that the indigenous Mi'kmaq would know and respect this other realm. But what amazed me was that just about everyone I met had a story about the little people.
What they do is they have, say you take about 3 or 4 straws. And what they do, they just braid it, make it as like a braid, yeah. But they don't. What they do, they don't take it off the ground. What they do is, they make a braid and they just let them go. They're just sitting down, something to do, making braids. That's what they do, yeah. I seen those braids before a couple times, yeah.
Just in the woods?
Just in the woods, yeah. I seen it out there before, yeah. Especially with like me and a couple other friends. We seen it before, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
We were swimming here, and then we went way out far to get coax, the big ones. Then when I dove down, then I got back up, and Eli, he saw it. Then he tapped me, we were looking at it, freaking out for a while, because we were looking at it. Then we thought it was nothing, and we dived again for more cohorts. And we went back up, we ran out of breath, we looked, it wasn't there anymore, man. We were a lot closer anyway, we were around, right around there, we were around there, man. We saw it.
What did he look like?
Yeah, he was small, man. No.
He was like around this big. Sound like that.
They didn't believe us at first, but we don't care what they think. Man.
So do you think they're still around then?
Guarantee. They're probably everywhere.
Everyone I talked to asked me if I'd spoken with the respected scholar Merdina Marshall. They said she had found images of little people in a photograph taken on a trip with her students to a sacred cave on the north shore of Cape Breton.
I saw a cave, a small cave about 2 feet wide, maybe, or even less, in the ground on the left. I said, and I told the students, don't go near it, let's just look at it. And we looked at it, and I took pictures. I took pictures from many angles. And then we left. And when the pictures were developed, there were images in the pictures. The believers believed them, and the non-believers, of course, didn't. They said there were shadows, that they're doctored, but the believers really saw them, and saw more than one. They saw a whole lot, and countless those who believe.
I guess it's had quite an effect in the community.
It had a very large effect, a big effect on the community. People from all over the Maritimes came, people from New Brunswick, Newfoundland, and everywhere. They just wanted to see for themselves and touch it and see it. If you're a scientific person, then you look at it from a scientific point of view and eliminate all of the possibilities, because science doesn't allow that. And so the little people have a hard time. It's very, very easy to call it superstition. It's only superstition. But if you gather your own beliefs, your own teachings, your own cultural trainings, and you place them, and you make a decision, not with your head, but with your heart. And you know it's no longer superstition, but a belief.
Maybe that's what my grandmother was trying to teach me, to believe in your imagination, to see with your heart. It certainly changes the way you look at the world.
You can't fool around with these little elves.
The elder, Roddy Bernard. So what did you see yourself?
We only seen a little man, huh? The way they had the beard on him and little hat on him. They was dressed nice. They had a little blue coat, little red pants. Yeah. And they had the white shirt on. Seen this little one. There was about 7 or 8 of us were seen them.
You all saw them?
Yeah, we all saw them. And this fellow chased them. Never saw it ever since. No.
So what happened to the fellow that chased him?
Oh, he took sick about 3-4 days after. Yeah. He was told not to fool around. And they're not very good to chase them or anything, not to bother them. So he took sick and passed away about 3 days after.
I've always been reluctant to come back here to this site because of our experience. I feel like I'm getting over a fear that I've had.
This is the first time in 25 years that Mary Rose Julian and her daughter April have been back to this place. It was once a favorite spot for the family to picnic.
I heard a noise and I started looking up. I knew there was no place where this noise could come from because nobody is very isolated, nobody lives here. And it was the most weirdest music you ever heard. It was like either voices or some kind of instrument. It was just indescribable. And I panicked. I told the boys, let's go. And I tried pulling the little one out of the water, and he was reluctant. Well, I was fighting with him to get out of the water because I heard this noise. And I asked my oldest, do you hear it? She said, yes. And I really panicked then because, you know, I wasn't hearing things then. So I took the boys, I shoved them in the car, and I hollered at the girls to hurry up. And I told them, hurry up, get in the car. You know, just get in the car! And I was yelling, screaming in my head. It took her a couple of minutes to get into the car, and finally when she got into the car, she yelled, don't look back, don't look. And me, I didn't listen to my mom, and I got up and I snuck a peek, and over there I saw one coming out of the woods, and there was already a bunch of them over there, and the one that came out of the woods joined the circle, and they were all like dancing around. And then I just sat back down and pretended I never saw anything because I was scared my mother would get mad at me for disobeying. And after we got home, I heard all these stories. If you tell anybody, you'll have bad luck. So I just kept my mouth shut all these years. I think it's about a year ago I first mentioned it. And how were they dancing? Did you tell them how they were dancing? You want to show them how they were dancing? They were like just holding hands and just like jumping around in a circle sort of thing, and then another one came out of the woods and then grabbed him. They grabbed onto him and they were singing. It was that noise that we heard. It was like they were singing and they were dancing all over the place, like in a circle, just over there. They sort of mixed right in with the background, and I don't know if they were see-through or what. I heard their clothes are made out of stuff from nature, but I'm not really sure if that's what I saw or what. They probably see us right now and wondering what we're doing out here, and little do they realize we're talking about them. You know, but I don't think they would come out unless we all started having some fun.
Well, that's what we should do.
Yeah, start dancing around.
And do you think they're here now?
Yeah. Yeah. Do you?
I feel something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.